When Aria Scott, a renowned black attorney, is wrongfully targeted by police while staying at a high-end hotel, her life takes an unexpected turn. The unjust encounter propels her into a battle against racial profiling, exposing deeply rooted biases in law enforcement. As Arya's pursuit of justice gains momentum, she faces not only external resistance but also internal struggles. But when one of the officers makes an unexpected move, Arya is forced to decide whether true change can emerge from dialogue with the very people who caused her pain. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Aria Scott stepped out of the taxi, feeling the heavy weight of her suitcase as she rolled it across the polished marble floor of the hotel lobby. Her arrival marked an important milestone. She was a keynote speaker at a prominent legal conference. The event had drawn attorneys, judges, and activists from across the country, all gathered to discuss issues of criminal justice reform, a topic Aria had dedicated her entire career to. Despite the importance of the event, Aria couldn't help but notice the initial reactions she received upon entering the hotel. Eyes followed her every move, and a few guests exchanged glances. Even the receptionist hesitated slightly when Aria approached the front desk. "Good evening," Aria said, her voice warm but firm. She handed over her ID and reservation details, noting the wary look in the receptionist's eyes. "Welcome, Ms. Scott," the receptionist replied, sounding almost surprised by the credentials on the screen. She processed the check-in quickly, but her posture remained guarded, as if expecting something unexpected. Unbothered, Aria took the key card and made her way to her room on the 10th floor. She was accustomed to navigating spaces where she wasn't always welcomed, and she had learned to carry herself with grace and dignity. Once in her room, she unpacked and carefully arranged her materials for the next day's presentation. The theme of her talk was breaking barriers in the legal system, focusing on racial disparities and the importance of unbiased law enforcement. She felt a sense of anticipation mixed with nervous excitement. Her phone buzzed. It was a reminder for a video call with her mother. Aria smiled and answered. "Hey, Mom. Just got settled in." "How's the hotel?" her mother asked. "It's nice enough," Aria replied, trying to sound more enthusiastic than she felt. "I'm ready for tomorrow." But as she was talking, she heard loud footsteps approaching her door. Before she could even react, there was a forceful knock, followed by an authoritative voice. "Police? Open up." Startled, Aria hung up the call and rushed to the door. "Who is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is the police. We need to conduct a search of your room." "Open the door now," came the urgent reply. Her heart pounded in her chest, confusion and fear mixing in equal measure. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door slowly. Four officers, all wearing stern expressions, pushed their way into the room. The lead officer, a tall man with a buzz cut, looked around suspiciously. "What is this about?" Aria asked, her voice now firm but calm. "We received an anonymous tip about illegal activities here," the officer replied curtly, not bothering to introduce himself. Aria's mind raced. "I think there's been a mistake. I'm a lawyer attending the conference. I've just checked in." The officer's expression didn't change. "We'll need to search the room. Stand aside, please." As the officers began to rummage through her belongings, Aria felt a deep sense of violation. She knew she had done nothing wrong, but she also knew what was happening. This was not about evidence, this was about assumptions. Aria stood still, watching the officers sift through her personal belongings. The search was invasive, with officers looking through her suitcase, her toiletries, and even flipping through the pages of her legal documents. Despite her composed exterior, her mind was reeling. This was an all-too-familiar scenario for many Black Americans, guilty until proven innocent, regardless of the facts. As the lead officer, identified by his badge as Officer Blake, moved toward her laptop, Aria's patience waned. "I have nothing to hide," she said, her voice edged with both exhaustion and indignation, "but I demand to know why you're doing this." Officer Blake paused, his eyes narrowed. "An anonymous tip," he repeated, emphasizing the last word as if it justified the intrusion. His tone was both dismissive and condescending. It was clear that he had already made up his mind about Arya based on her appearance. Another officer, younger and seemingly less convinced of the necessity of the search, glanced at Arya with a hint of discomfort. He cleared his throat and muttered, "Are you sure we got the right room, Blake? This doesn't seem right." But Blake ignored his colleague. His gaze was fixed on Arya, as though he were trying to find cracks in her confidence. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Arya met his gaze directly. "I'm here to present at a legal conference," she said. "I'm a lawyer specializing in criminal justice reform." Blake's smirk was almost imperceptible. "Criminal justice reform, huh? Well, tonight you're the subject of a police investigation." The remark stung, but Arya remained composed. "I understand you have a job to do," she said calmly, "but this search is unjustified and based on false information. I'll be filing a formal complaint." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly conflicted. He began hesitantly, "We're just following up on the report." Arya softened slightly at his evident discomfort. "I get that," she replied, her voice gentler. "But you need to understand that this kind of treatment is part of a much bigger problem. You're perpetuating a stereotype, not protecting the public." Blake's face hardened at her words. "We don't get to pick and choose which tips we respond to," he retorted. "We follow up, no matter who it is. Or what color they are," Arya added quietly, more to herself than to Blake. But the comment hit its mark, causing the younger officer to look away, as if ashamed. The search dragged on for what felt like an eternity, but nothing illegal or suspicious was found. The officer's body language shifted slightly, from aggressive to mildly defensive. They were unable to find any evidence to support the tip, and Arya could see a flicker of embarrassment in their eyes, except for Blake, who remained obstinate. As they prepared to leave, Arya couldn't resist one last remark. "You stormed into my room based on a tip that you haven't even verified. Do you realize how dangerous that is?" Blake's response was cold and dismissive. "We were just doing our job," he repeated, as if the phrase could absolve him of responsibility. The younger officer, however, looked genuinely remorseful. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, as he followed Blake out of the room. Arya closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. She felt both violated and angered by the encounter. Despite her professional success and the respect she had earned in her field, she was still subjected to the same biases and assumptions that countless others faced. Taking a deep breath, Arya sat down and opened her laptop. She had always been a fighter, and this incident would be no different. She started drafting a detailed account of the night's events, determined to turn this traumatic experience into an opportunity for change. Within hours, Arya's social media post about the incident began to gain traction. She had a substantial following, not just because of her legal work, but also due to her advocacy for justice and equality. Messages of support poured in, some from colleagues, others from strangers who shared similar experiences. "Stay strong," one comment read. "You're doing the right thing by speaking out." "Thank you for being a voice for all of us," wrote another. Arya's anger transformed into determination. This wasn't just about her, it was about confronting a system that continued to discriminate based on appearance. She realized she had an opportunity to make a bigger impact, not just for herself, but for others who couldn't always speak out as she could. Later that night, Maya called. "Arya, I saw your post. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Arya said, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "I'm not going to let this break me." "But Maya, it's just so exhausting, having to prove your worth every single time." Maya's voice was filled with empathy. "I know. It's unfair and it's unjust. But you're not alone in this fight. You've got allies, and we're going to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Maya's words brought Arya a sense of comfort, but they also fueled her determination. "I'm filing a formal complaint against the department," Arya said firmly. "And I want to take this to the media. People need to know what's happening, even in supposed safe spaces." "Count me in," Maya replied without hesitation. "Let's make them listen." As the call ended, Arya felt a renewed sense of purpose. The night's events had shaken her, but they had also reignited her passion for justice. This wasn't just about clearing her name, it was about challenging a system that needed to change. Arya knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she couldn't afford to be silent. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she made a silent promise to herself she would turn this injustice into an opportunity for growth, awareness, and, ultimately, change. The morning after the unsettling incident, Arya was physically free but mentally burdened by the injustice she had just experienced. As she looked out the window at the bustling street below, her thoughts were filled with the harsh realities of being a black woman in America. Even with a law degree, a respected career, and a spotless record, she was not immune to racial profiling. This realization was both painful and galvanizing. Arya dressed carefully for the day ahead. She put on a crisp black blazer, a symbol of her professionalism and resilience. Her appearance was more than a matter of personal pride, it was her armor in a world that often judged her by her skin color before considering her words. She took one last look in the mirror, squared her shoulders, and prepared to head to the police station. Maya met Arya outside the station, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" she asked gently. "Absolutely," Arya replied without hesitation. "This isn't just about me, Maya. It's about everyone who has been unjustly targeted and doesn't have the resources or the voice to fight back." Together, they walked into the station, greeted by the sterile smell of disinfectant and the low hum of conversations. Arya approached the front desk, keeping her tone calm and professional. "I'd like to file a formal complaint about last night's incident at the hotel." The officer behind the desk, a woman with a stern expression, raised an eyebrow but remained neutral. "And what exactly is the nature of your complaint?" Arya took a deep breath. "I was wrongly targeted based on an unverified tip. The officers conducted an intrusive search of my hotel room without probable cause, solely based on my race." The officer's eyes flickered with surprise, but she kept her voice even. "We take all complaints seriously. I'll need you to fill out some forms." As Arya sat down to complete the paperwork, she couldn't help but notice the curious stares from a few officers walking by. It was a familiar feeling, being an object of curiosity, suspicion, or both. But she wasn't here to be intimidated, she was here to hold the system accountable. Once the forms were filled out, Arya and Maya were directed to an internal affairs officer. They were ushered into a small office, where a middle-aged man with tired eyes greeted them. "I'm Lieutenant Harris," he said, offering a weak smile. "I understand you have a complaint about one of our officers." Arya nodded, her expression firm. "Yes, I do." "The officers involved stormed into my hotel room based on a flimsy, anonymous tip. They had no real evidence, yet treated me as if I were a criminal." Lieutenant Harris leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "I understand your frustration, Ms. Scott. But you have to understand, we receive countless tips every day. We're obligated to investigate them." Arya's eyes flashed with determination. "I'm not disputing your need to investigate tips, Lieutenant. I'm challenging the manner in which it was done. There was no verification, no attempt to confirm the credibility of the information. I was treated as guilty from the start, solely because of my appearance." Harris sighed, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I won't deny that racial profiling is a serious issue," he admitted. "But change takes time, and we're working on it." "That's not good enough," Arya replied, her voice unwavering. "Change needs to be proactive, not reactive. You can't wait until someone's rights are violated before addressing the problem." Maya, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "Lieutenant, Arya is not just another victim of racial profiling. She's a respected lawyer and activist. This incident could have serious legal implications, not just for the officers involved, but for the entire department." The mention of potential legal action seemed to make Harris shift in his seat. "I understand," he said slowly. "We'll conduct a thorough review of the officers' actions that night. If there were any breaches of protocol, appropriate measures will be taken. After leaving the station, Arya felt a mix of frustration and determination. The formal complaint was a step forward, but she knew it wasn't enough. The system was slow, often reluctant to hold its own accountable. But Arya had more tools at her disposal than most. She had a platform, a network, and the law itself on her side. Back at the hotel, Arya received a call from a local journalist named Marcus, who had seen her social media post about the incident. "Miss Scott, I'd like to hear more about what happened to you last night," he said. This could be an important story. Arya agreed to meet with Marcus in the hotel lobby. He was a young, ambitious reporter with a keen sense for stories that challenged the status quo. As they sat down for coffee, Arya recounted the events in detail, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about one night or one mistaken tip," Arya explained. "It's about a culture of assumptions that has real, damaging consequences. It's about how, no matter how successful or law-abiding you are, you can still be treated as less than because of your skin color." Marcus nodded, taking notes rapidly. "What do you hope to achieve by speaking out?" he asked. "I want accountability," Arya said firmly. "Not just for myself, but for everyone who has faced this kind of injustice. I want to see real changes in police protocols, better training, and a commitment to fair treatment for all citizens." The story quickly gained momentum, spreading across social media and news outlets. Arya's calm yet powerful voice struck a chord with many, drawing attention to an issue that was often discussed but rarely addressed with meaningful action. Back at the police station, the ripple effects of Arya's complaint were starting to be felt. Officer Blake was called into a meeting with his superiors, where he was confronted with the details of the complaint. He was defensive at first, insisting that he had only done his duty. But the growing media attention put pressure on the department to take a harder look at their procedures. Blake's partner, the younger officer who had shown some discomfort during the search, was also interviewed by Internal Affairs. He hesitated before admitting, "I felt something was off about the whole situation. It just didn't seem right." The internal investigation wasn't quick or seamless, but it was a step in the right direction. Arya knew she had made an impact, but she also knew that change wouldn't come overnight. It was a marathon, not a sprint. Yet, with every story she told, with every barrier she faced head-on, she was paving the way for a more just and equal society. By the end of the week, Arya's determination had only grown stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the countless others who had been silenced by the system. And she wasn't done yet. There were more battles to fight, more voices to uplift, and more change to demand. But for now, she felt a small sense of victory. Her voice had been heard, and the fight for justice was only just beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind of media appearances, interviews, and public statements. Arya's story had caught fire, and people from all walks of life were rallying around her. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags calling for an end to racial profiling and police bias. Activists, legal experts, and even some local politicians reached out to express their support. Arya's experience had become more than just one woman's fight, it was now a symbol of broader systemic issues that needed to be addressed. Despite the public support, Arya felt the weight of the spotlight. She was determined, but she was also exhausted. The emotional toll of recounting her story over and over again started to wear on her. Yet, she knew she had to keep pushing, her efforts were making a real impact, and stepping back now could mean losing momentum. "Remember, Arya," Maya said one afternoon as they prepared for another interview, "this isn't just about the incident. It's about how we can use this moment to advocate for lasting change." Arya nodded, her expression resolute. "I know. That's why I have to keep going. People are listening, and we need to make sure they understand that this is bigger than just me." Maya smiled. "You're doing more than that, Arya. You're giving people hope." But Arya's advocacy was not without resistance. The police department released a brief statement claiming that the search of Arya's room was conducted in accordance with standard procedures, and that they were reviewing the incident to ensure all protocols were followed. The language was defensive and lacked any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. That's a non-apology if I've ever heard one, Aria muttered as she read the statement online. Marcus, the journalist who had first interviewed Aria, followed up with her. They're trying to minimize the impact, he said over the phone. They don't want to admit there's a deeper problem here. Aria wasn't surprised. They're trying to protect themselves, she agreed. But we're not going to let them brush this under the rug. We need to keep the pressure on. That same day, Aria decided to hold a press conference in front of the hotel where the incident had occurred. The small courtyard quickly filled with reporters, activists, and supporters who held signs calling for justice and reform. Aria stood at the makeshift podium, feeling both empowered and vulnerable. She took a deep breath before addressing the crowd. I stand before you today not just as a lawyer or an activist, but as a woman who was unjustly targeted based on assumptions, she began. Her voice was clear and strong, resonating with emotion. What happened to me is not unique. It's part of a pattern that affects thousands of people across this country, particularly black and brown individuals. It's a pattern that undermines trust, perpetuates fear, and destroys lives. The crowd nodded in agreement, some shouting words of encouragement. Aria continued, we need accountability, but we also need systemic change. We need better training for officers, we need stricter guidelines for searches, and most importantly, we need a commitment to seeing all individuals as worthy of respect and fair treatment. Her words were met with applause, and Aria felt a surge of energy. This was her element, turning pain into purpose, using her voice to demand better. As she stepped away from the podium, she was approached by a group of civil rights lawyers who offered to support her in any legal actions she wished to pursue. We believe in your cause, Aria, one of them said. We're here to help. Later that evening, as Aria and Maya sat in Aria's hotel room reviewing the day's events, Aria's phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source. It was Officer Blake's partner, the young officer who had been part of the search. His message was brief, I want to talk. I have something to say. Maya looked at Aria, her eyes wide with surprise. Do you think he's sincere? Aria was skeptical, but she also saw an opportunity. I don't know, but it's worth hearing him out. They agreed to meet at a nearby coffee shop the next morning. When Aria arrived, she found the young officer waiting nervously at a corner table. He stood up as she approached, looking unsure of how to greet her. Thank you for meeting me, he said awkwardly, motioning for her to sit. Aria's tone was polite but cautious. What did you want to talk about? The officer, who introduced himself as Officer Daniels, looked down at his coffee cup. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. What happened that night wasn't right, and I should have spoken up. Aria's eyes softened, but she maintained a steady gaze. Why didn't you? Daniels sighed. It's complicated. Blake is persuasive, and I was afraid of the backlash if I went against him. But after seeing the public reaction, I realized that staying silent only makes things worse. Aria appreciated his honesty, but she wasn't ready to let him off the hook entirely. It's not just about speaking up now, Daniels. It's about what you do moving forward. Will you stand against racial profiling, even when it's uncomfortable? Will you support real changes in your department? Daniels nodded earnestly. I want to do better. I'm willing to testify about what really happened that night if it helps. The offer surprised Aria, but she saw it as a potential turning point. It could help, she admitted. But understand this, change requires courage, and it won't be easy. Daniels looked determined. I know. But I want to be part of the solution. As Aria left the coffee shop, she felt a strange mix of hope and skepticism. She knew Daniels' willingness to testify could be pivotal in holding the department accountable, but she also understood that systemic change required more than one officer's admission. In the days that followed, Daniels' testimony became a key part of Aria's campaign for justice. His acknowledgement of the biased nature of the search added credibility to her claims and put more pressure on the police department to respond meaningfully. The media coverage intensified, and Aria's message reached new audiences. But it wasn't just about winning public sympathy. Aria wanted real reforms, mandatory bias training, better vetting of anonymous tips, and stronger disciplinary measures for officers who engaged in racial profiling. She began working closely with local civil rights organizations to draft policy recommendations aimed at reducing bias in law enforcement. Officer Blake, meanwhile, found himself under increasing scrutiny. The internal affairs investigation was still ongoing, and he was placed on temporary suspension pending the results. He remained defensive, insisting to his colleagues that he had done nothing wrong. But the growing public backlash forced him to confront the reality of his actions. One night, as Aria was reviewing case files in her hotel room, she received an unexpected call. It was Blake. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice tense. Aria was taken aback. "Why should I listen to anything you have to say?" she replied, her voice sharp. "Because I want to understand," Blake said, his tone softer than before. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I need to hear your side." Aria hesitated. She had never imagined having a personal conversation with Blake. But she also recognized the potential for genuine change, even in the most unlikely of places. "Fine," she said finally. "But this conversation isn't for my benefit. It's for yours." Blake agreed, and they set a time to meet. As Aria hung up the phone, she realized that the road to change was long, unpredictable, and full of unexpected twists. But she also understood that progress often began with uncomfortable conversations, even with those who had been part of the problem. In that moment, Aria felt a sense of cautious hope. The journey was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted. And as long as she kept pushing, she believed those seeds could one day grow into a more just and equitable society. The meeting with Officer Blake was set for a small, neutral cafe in the outskirts of town. Aria arrived early, feeling a mix of wariness and resolve. It wasn't just another meeting, it was a step toward understanding the human dimension behind the badge. Despite everything, she was open to dialogue. She understood that genuine change required confronting uncomfortable truths, even from the other side. Blake entered the cafe, his expression uncertain and his posture less commanding than the night they'd first met. He scanned the room until he spotted Aria, then walked over slowly, as if he were unsure of his welcome. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said, taking a seat across from her. Aria nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm here to listen. But understand that this isn't about forgiving or forgetting. It's about clarity." Blake sighed deeply, visibly struggling to find the right words. "I know what I did that night was wrong," he began, his voice low. "And I want you to know that it wasn't personal. I didn't know you, but I made assumptions." Aria raised an eyebrow. "Assumptions that could have cost me my safety, dignity, or worse," she said, her tone sharp but not angry. "Do you even realize the impact of what you did?" Blake's face was a mix of regret and defensiveness. "I'm trying to," he admitted. "I've spent the past few weeks thinking about what happened, and I see now how biased I was. But it's not just about that night. It's about the training, the culture, and everything we're taught to assume." Aria leaned forward, her gaze steady. "So, what are you going to do about it?" "Acknowledging it is a start, but it's not enough." "How are you going to change?" Blake seemed to appreciate Aria's directness. "I've signed up for the department's new bias training program," he said slowly. "I know that's just a small step, but I want to understand how my biases affect my work and the people I'm supposed to protect." Aria's eyes narrowed slightly, searching for sincerity in Blake's words. "You can attend all the training sessions you want, but the real change comes from within. It's about challenging the things you've internalized over years, things that you may not even be aware of." Blake nodded, his expression earnest. "I know it's going to be hard, but I want to be part of the solution. I'm tired of feeling like the enemy, especially when I joined this job to help people." Aria softened slightly, but she wasn't ready to absolve Blake completely. "If you're serious about changing, then use your voice to influence others. Talk to your colleagues, speak up when you see injustice, and understand that change starts with you." The conversation ended on a note of cautious understanding. While Aria was still wary of Blake's intentions, she recognized that this dialogue could be a small crack in the wall of systemic bias. For the first time, Blake was genuinely listening, and that, in itself, was a small victory. As Aria left the cafe, she felt a weight lift, but not entirely. She knew that for every officer Blake willing to engage in dialogue, there were many more who remained entrenched in their biases. Yet, she couldn't afford to be cynical. Her work wasn't just about confronting the system, it was about planting seeds of awareness, one person at a time. Back at her hotel room, Aria received a call from one of the civil rights lawyers she had partnered with. "We're making progress," the lawyer said excitedly. "The department is now reviewing its procedures for handling anonymous tips and planning to implement stricter verification measures before conducting searches." Aria smiled, feeling a sense of validation. "That's a start," she said. "But we need to make sure these changes are enforced, not just written on paper." Her foundation work was also gaining momentum. Inspired by the incident, Aria had launched a new initiative aimed at providing legal aid and resources to individuals facing racial profiling and discrimination. The Foundation's mission was simple: to fight bias through awareness, advocacy, and accountability. One afternoon, as Aria prepared for a press conference to announce the Foundation's official launch, she felt a mix of anticipation and humility. This wasn't just about one woman's fight, it was about creating a platform for countless others who had been silenced by a system that often failed them. The press conference drew a significant crowd, with reporters, activists, and community members eager to hear Aria's vision. As she took the stage, she paused for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The trauma of the incident was still raw, but it had been transformed into something powerful. "Today is not just about me," she began, her voice strong yet filled with emotion. "It's about all of us who have faced prejudice and bias, who have been judged by the color of our skin instead of the content of our character. It's about creating a system that truly serves justice, rather than perpetuating injustice." Her words were met with applause, but Aria knew that applause wasn't the goal. Real change required more than just agreement, it required action. As she spoke, she felt a surge of determination. This was her moment, but it was also a moment for everyone fighting for a more just and equal society. As the event concluded, Aria was approached by a young woman, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I went through something similar, but I didn't have the courage to speak out. Seeing you here gives me hope." Aria's heart swelled with a mix of empathy and responsibility. "You have more courage than you know," she replied, taking the woman's hand. "And remember, you're not alone." Meanwhile, Officer Blake's journey toward redemption was only beginning. The department's bias training sessions were more challenging than he'd anticipated. He found himself grappling with uncomfortable truths about his upbringing, his assumptions, and the culture of policing. But he kept attending, determined to learn and grow. He also began speaking to his fellow officers about the importance of empathy and fairness, often facing resistance but occasionally sparking meaningful conversations. One day, as Aria was working in her office, she received an email from Blake. It was brief but sincere. "I wanted to thank you for meeting with me. I've learned a lot, and I'm committed to doing better. Your story changed me, and I hope it can change others too." Aria read the email with a mix of skepticism and hope. Change was rarely linear, and she knew Blake's journey, like her own, would be filled with setbacks. But she also knew that small steps could lead to significant shifts. Months passed, and Aryas Foundation began to make tangible strides. They hosted community workshops, provided legal resources for those wrongfully detained, and engaged in policy advocacy to push for more equitable law enforcement practices. Aria's story had evolved from a painful personal experience into a broader movement for justice. One evening, as Aria stood on a stage at a large criminal justice reform event, she scanned the crowd, searching for familiar faces. Among the attendees, she spotted Daniels, the young officer who had initially reached out with an apology. Next to him, to her surprise, was Blake, sitting quietly but attentively. As Aria spoke about the need for systemic change, she saw something in Blake's eyes, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the impact of his past actions, but also a hint of hope for a better path forward. It was a small but meaningful moment, a reminder that even the most entrenched biases could begin to shift when confronted with empathy, understanding, and a commitment to change. The event concluded with Arya's final words: "The fight for justice is never over, but it's always worth it." We must be willing to face our own biases, engage in uncomfortable conversations, and demand accountability, not just from others, but from ourselves. Because true change starts with each of us. The audience erupted in applause, not just for Arya, but for the possibility of a more just world. As she stepped off the stage, she felt a mix of relief, gratitude, and a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been painful and exhausting, but it had also been transformative. Arya had turned her personal trauma into a force for change, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to new beginnings. And as the night drew to a close, Arya knew that while there was still much work to be done, she had taken a significant step forward, not just for herself, but for countless others who dared to believe in the power of justice, empathy, and redemption. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.